Beneath a windswept ridge in northern England, a line of stone still runs in a straight and deliberate scar across the hills, long after the men who built it have vanished into the ground beside it. Foundations of barrack blocks form neat rectangles beneath the grass, and broken tombstones nearby still name soldiers who came from Spain, from Syria, from the Balkans. Men who died defending a frontier thousands of miles from the villages where they were born. The empire that placed them there is gone. The army that carried them there took centuries to build, and centuries more to unmake. And it did not look the same at any 2 points along that journey. Strip away nearly every trace of the world we recognize as Roman, and travel backward, past the emperors, past the provinces, past the marble and the roads. And there is no legion waiting at the beginning. There is only a small farming community beside a river in central Italy, surrounded by rival towns speaking different languages. Its men expected to leave their fields with whatever weapons they owned whenever danger approached. A citizen levy answering a seasonal threat is a long way from a professional force holding 3 continents, and the distance between those two realities is the real subject of this story. Somewhere between a farmer walking home after a border skirmish and a soldier, spending 30 years in a fortress on the Rhine, an institution had to reinvent itself again and again, surviving catastrophic defeats, swallowing entire allied peoples, outgrowing the republic that created it, and finally splitting into a shape its founders would barely recognize. Understanding how that happened means starting where Rome itself started, long before anyone called its fighting men a legion in the way we imagine today. In its earliest recorded centuries, Rome was one settlement among many in Latium, ringed by Sabine, Etruscan, and other Latin communities with their own ambitions, and warfare that was local, seasonal, and tied directly to land and household. Because the sources describing this period were written many generations later, historians remain cautious about reconstructing its exact military structure. But the underlying logic is clear enough. A man's obligation to fight was bound to his property and his standing in the community, so those who could afford armor and weapons served as heavier infantry, while poorer citizens filled lighter roles. Central Italy in this era was not an isolated world. Ideas about arms, formation, and tactics moved between Rome and its neighbors, including communities influenced by Greek and Etruscan military culture. And Roman armies for a time appear to have fought in dense, shield-to-shield formations resembling those used elsewhere in the Mediterranean. But Rome's ambitions did not stay confined to open plains. As the young state expanded across the Italian peninsula, it collided with hill peoples fighting in broken, forested, and mountainous terrain, where a single rigid mass of spearmen struggled to maneuver. And therefore, gradually and without a single defining reform, Roman infantry evolved into smaller, more flexible units capable of separating, advancing, and regrouping independently. This flexible arrangement, later known to history as the manipular legion, did not emerge from one law passed in one year. It took shape across generations of hard experience against the varied warfare of Italy. For an ordinary soldier of this era, service was an interruption rather than an identity. He marched, he fought a campaign that rarely lasted more than a season, and he returned to his land expecting the obligation to end. That assumption would hold for a long time yet, but Rome's growing success in Italy was quietly building toward wars far larger than any single city could fight alone. And the very expansion that flexible infantry made possible would soon demand more men, more time, and more distance than the old citizen-farmer model could comfortably provide. By the time Rome had bound most of the Italian peninsula into a network of allied and subject communities, its armies no longer marched to war as isolated Roman citizens. Italian allied contingents fought alongside Roman legions in roughly equal numbers, forming a combined manpower base unmatched by most rivals in the Western Mediterranean. This deep pool of soldiers became essential once Rome's ambitions collided with Carthage, a rival trading power controlling much of the Western Sea, and the wars between them grew larger, longer, and more distant from Italy's shores than anything Rome had fought before. In the year 216 before the Common Era, that expanding conflict produced one of the most devastating defeats in Roman history at Cannae, where the Carthaginian general Hannibal encircled and annihilated a Roman army of extraordinary size, drawing its heavy infantry into a trap that closed on every side. It would have been reasonable, watching the scale of that slaughter, to assume Rome's military system had failed outright. Instead, the crucial lesson of Cannae was not that Roman soldiers could be beaten, because they clearly could, but that Rome refused to treat a shattered army as a shattered war. Fresh legions were raised. Most of the Italian alliance held together, despite Hannibal's efforts to break it apart, and Roman commanders shifted their strategy away from chasing one decisive battle towards slowly strangling Carthage's resources in Spain and North Africa instead. That institutional stubbornness, more than any single tactic or weapon, proved to be Rome's deepest military advantage, and it carried the war to a Carthaginian defeat within a generation. Victory, however, did not let the army rest. Having learned it could survive catastrophe far from home, Rome now found itself drawn into Greece, Macedonia, and Spain, campaigns lasting years, rather than a single season. And a farmer levied for a short local defense was simply not the same instrument needed to hold conquered provinces across the sea. Every triumph added new commitments, new borders to garrison, and new distances between a soldier and the household he had left behind, and the very success that flexible Italian manpower had won for Rome was steadily making the old citizen army assumptions impossible to sustain. As Roman power spread across the Mediterranean, the internal organization of its armies kept shifting to meet the new scale of warfare, and over the final 2 centuries before the Common Era, the maniple, once the core tactical unit, gradually gave way in practice to the larger and more flexible cohort, a change that unfolded across decades of campaigning, rather than in a single moment. One figure often credited with transforming the army, almost single-handedly, was the general Marius, who, in the year 107 before the Common Era, opened recruitment to citizens without property in order to fill the ranks for a difficult war in North Africa. It is tempting to treat this as the instant the professional legion was born, but that framing oversimplifies a slower process. Broader recruitment, longer service expectations, and cohort-based tactics developed across many years, not in one dramatic reform. A separate and equally consequential shift came through Rome's Italian allies themselves, who had supplied soldiers and blood for generations without receiving citizenship in return. Their resentment erupted into the social war, and by the time it ended in the late 80s before the Common Era, Roman citizenship had been extended across most of Italy, dissolving the old line between citizen legionary and allied auxiliary, and, in effect, widening the very meaning of what it was to be Roman. Meanwhile, prolonged campaigns and enormous plunder gave successful generals, something the Republic had never fully reckoned with. Soldiers whose expectations of pay, reward, and land after discharge increasingly depended on the personal influence of their commander rather than on the state itself. The Republic's political institutions, built for a smaller and more local world, proved unable to consistently satisfy those expectations, and armies became a currency of political power among Rome's ambitious elite. That volatile combination reached its breaking point in the year 49 before the Common Era, when Julius Caesar led his army across the Rubicon River into Italy, choosing to resolve a political dispute through the force of soldiers loyal to him, rather than through institutions that could no longer contain the crisis. Civil war followed civil war in the years after, as rival commander and their armies fought one another rather than foreign enemies. And by the time the fighting finally ended near Actium, Rome possessed more soldiers than ever before, yet no longer possessed the republic that had once claimed to command them. Out of those decades of civil war emerged a single victor, who understood that simply winning was not enough. The military machine that had destroyed the republic still had to be managed, or it would destroy whatever came next as well. Augustus reduced the swollen, rival-aligned armies of the civil wars down to a fixed core of roughly 28 legions, transforming them from temporary instruments of competing warlords into a permanent standing force, answerable to the emperor alone. Its soldiers now serving on fixed terms with defined pay and guaranteed rewards at discharge, rather than depending on whichever general happened to be generous. Alongside these citizen legions, non-citizen soldiers drawn from the provinces filled specialized roles as infantry, cavalry, and light troops in units known as the auxiliaries, giving Rome access to skills and manpower its citizen ranks alone could not supply, while offering provincial recruits a path towards citizenship at the end of their service and binding distant peoples more tightly to the Roman state. This new army no longer clustered near Italy, waiting for the next campaign. It was stationed permanently along the Rhine, the Danube, and the eastern frontiers, transforming from a force assembled for war into a fixed military geography of forts and garrisons that would define the empire's edges for centuries. Yet permanence did not mean invincibility. In the year 9 of the Common Era, 3 legions under the commander Marius were lured deep into the forests of Germania and annihilated. A disaster that shocked Rome and permanently checked its ambitions east of the Rhine, even as Roman expansion continued elsewhere. The lesson of that defeat was not that the standing army had failed, but that even the most professional force in the ancient world still faced real limits of geography, terrain, and intelligence. Augustus had solved the Republic's fatal question of who controlled the army, placing it firmly under imperial authority. But in doing so, he had also created something the Republic never had to manage on this scale. A vast, expensive, permanent institution that now had to be paid, fed, moved, and maintained every single day, war or no war, for as long as the empire wished to survive. That daily burden built an entire world behind the frontier, one far larger than any single battlefield. Legionary fortresses rose along the Rhine, the Danube, and the deserts of Syria, their barracks laid out in disciplined rows, their workshops producing tools and weapons, their granaries and stables supporting animals and men who might never see Italy in their lifetimes. Roads built to move troops quickly between trouble spots doubled as arteries for tax revenue, trade goods, and administrative orders, binding the provinces to Rome as tightly as any conquest had. Standardized training and permanent bases gave the legions institutional memory that outlasted any single commander, while auxiliary units, increasingly woven into daily military life, connected provincial communities to Roman citizenship and Roman identity in ways conquest alone never could. 2 emperors of this era captured the 2 faces of the same military system. Trajan drove the army outward in aggressive conquest, most famously across the Danube into Dacia, while his successor Hadrian turned that same force toward consolidation. walking the frontiers himself and overseeing fortifications, such as the wall that still bears his name, across northern Britain. A barrier not meant to seal the empire shut, but to control and monitor everything that crossed it. Around these forts, civilian settlements grew almost automatically, since thousands of soldiers needed grain, pottery, leather, and services that merchants and craftsmen were eager to supply. And veterans who finished their service often chose to remain nearby rather than return to distant homelands, turning frontier zones into genuine communities rather than isolated military camps. This was, by nearly any ancient standard, an extraordinarily stable arrangement, capable of concentrating enormous force wherever a single serious threat appeared. Its hidden weakness was precisely that stability depended on having enough time, money, and calm elsewhere to shift troops from one danger to another. As long as crises arrived one at a time, the system held. The moment threats began arriving everywhere at once, the entire structure would be tested as never before. That moment arrived with brutal speed in the 3rd century of the Common Era, when Rome faced Sasanian Persia in the east, Germanic peoples pressing across the Rhine and Danube in the north, and an unrelenting cycle of internal usurpations that turned Roman legions against one another almost as often as against foreign enemies. Under the Severan emperors, soldiers' pay and political weight increased sharply. A recognition that imperial survival now depended directly on military loyalty. And in the year 212, that logic extended even further when the Emperor Caracalla granted Roman citizenship to nearly every free inhabitant of the empire, quietly dissolving the old legal distinction between citizen legionary and provincial auxiliary that had structured the army for generations. But citizenship alone could not solve the empire's deeper problem. A frontier system built for one crisis at a time was being asked to answer several at once, and legions pulled away from their posts to support one emperor against a rival often left entire regions exposed to invasion. The devastation of that instability reached a symbolic low point in the year 260, when the Emperor Valerian was captured alive by the Persian king Shapur I, an image of Roman authority humiliated on foreign soil that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. Yet the empire did not simply collapse afterward. Commanders and emperors, including Aurelian, fought their way through the following years to reunite much of the fractured territory, proving that Roman military resilience, the same quality first tested at Cannae, had not disappeared, even under this pressure. What the crisis did permanently change was the shape of the army itself, as commanders increasingly relied on detachments pulled from larger units and organized for rapid movement rather than static frontier defense, laying the practical groundwork for a more mobile military system that later emperors would formalize rather than invent from nothing. Out of that hard experience, the emperors Diocletian and Constantine built a Roman army organized around two complementary functions rather than one uniform legionary model. Frontier forces, often called limitani, held fixed positions along the borders, while more mobile field armies, the comitatenses, could be concentrated quickly wherever invasion or rebellion threatened. This was not evidence of decline dressed up in new terminology. It was a deliberate answer to a strategic reality the old system could no longer meet alone. Even this reorganized army could suffer devastating defeat, as it did in the year 378 at Adrianople, where the Eastern Emperor Valens was killed, and a major Roman field army was destroyed by Gothic forces it had underestimated. The shock was real, but Rome did not stop fielding armies afterward, and the true significance of Adrianople lay less in the battle itself than in what followed. as the empire increasingly had to combine warfare with diplomacy, negotiated settlement, and the absorption of entire armed peoples along and within its borders. Through the 5th century, the Western army drew on soldiers and commanders of remarkably diverse origin and on federate forces bound to Rome by treaty rather than conquest, a pattern that was not new in itself, since Rome had always absorbed outside manpower, but that now interacted with a Western government steadily losing territory, tax revenue, and the political cohesion needed to fund an independent military establishment. When the last Western emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in the year 476, the event was less a single military catastrophe than the visible endpoint of decades in which the Western state had gradually lost the fiscal and political capacity to sustain the army it had built. Soldiers, officers, and Roman military traditions did not vanish from Italy or Gaul overnight, but without an emperor and an intact state behind them, they no longer formed the same institution. In the East, however, a Roman army answering to a Roman emperor in Constantinople continued to fight, adapt, and evolve for centuries afterward, carrying the same institutional identity into a future that later historians would eventually rename Byzantine. Though its soldiers never stopped calling themselves Roman. Return, then, to that windswept frontier where this story began, where a straight stone road still cuts through the grass, and a soldier's name still survives on a broken tombstone far from wherever he was born. The empire that placed him there did not fail because its army forgot how to fight. It transformed over and over because the world it was defending kept changing shape beneath it, and each transformation demanded a different kind of force. A citizen levy became a flexible manipular army because Italy's wars demanded flexibility. That army became a Mediterranean fighting machine because conquest demanded reach. And that reach broke the citizen farmer model that had built it in the first place. Ambitious commanders and their loyal soldiers broke the republic itself, and Augustus answered by binding the army permanently to the imperial state, rather than to individual generals. Peace and prosperity built a frontier world of forts and roads, until threats arriving from every direction at once exposed the limits of a static system. And Rome answered again, with frontier garrisons and mobile field armies working in tandem. In the West, the state that had to feed, pay, and hold this vast machine together eventually ran out of territory and revenue to do so, and the army dissolved into the political landscape that replaced it. In the East, the same tradition simply kept going. What endured in the end was never one uniform of armor or one unchanging formation marching unbroken through 1,000 years. What endured was the habit of reinvention itself, the willingness to become a different kind of army whenever the old one could no longer answer the world it faced. And that habit, more than any weapon Rome ever carried, is the truest legacy still written into the stones along that frontier.